Students, welcome to this lecture on women's rights. This lecture introduces the broad idea of women's rights in India and globally. It begins with the understanding that women's rights are not a separate set of privileges but an essential component of human rights. Throughout history, women have been positioned unequally in relation to men, often limited to domestic and reproductive roles. In India, this inequality has not been constant. It has changed from one period to another. While the ancient Vedic age offered equality of opportunity in matters of education, marriage, and other kinds of independence, and therefore women such as Gargi and Maitreyi became Vedacharinis, Brahmacharinis, and eminent academicians of that time. But later, social practices slowly took away those freedoms. One reason was decline of pristine religion. The objective of this lecture is to trace how that journey of loss and recovery shaped modern equality. It also clarifies key terms like gender, patriarchy, and rights, and how they affect social order. Students should understand that every form of discrimination begins in the family and extends outward into institutions. Family is the basic unit of any society or a state. An individual learns most of the values and behavior patterns from the family, which are then disseminated throughout the society. So, if the family is just has the value or respect the value of equality, secularism, democracy, then obviously the society and state will also have justice, equality, and democracy inherent in its character. Therefore, studying women's rights means studying social change itself, how the society changes from one period to another. By the end of this lecture, learners should see equality as both an ethical principle and a national goal guaranteed by Indian Constitution and supported by international human rights law. Women's rights refer to the full and equal enjoyment of civil, political, social, economic, and cultural rights by women, which are enjoyed by their male counterpart. These include right to education, property, work, health, safety, and participation in decision making. The idea evolved as societies realized that justice cannot exist when half the population is denied autonomy, or the society cannot develop if half of the population is underdeveloped. Historically, laws and customs often treated women as dependents, first of the father, then of the husband, and finally of the son. Even when ancient Indian texts granted certain privileges, later interpretations confined women to domestic spaces, curtailing their mobility and autonomy. The demand for women's rights challenges this hierarchy and insists that women must enjoy dignity and opportunity on the same terms as men. The UDHR of 1948 reinforced this by proclaiming that all human beings are born free and equal. Credit goes to Hansa Mehta, an Indian woman who was instrumental in the drafting of UDHR, and she literally insisted that the language should either be all women and men are entitled to all kinds of rights, or else all human beings are entitled to all these rights. So instead of male, the term was substituted with human beings. In modern India, constitutional provisions such as Articles 14, 15, and 16 reaffirm legal equality. Understanding these principles helps its student connect personal present policies and movements to a much older moral argument that freedom, respect, and uh, equal treatment are natural, not granted entitlements of every human being. Gender equality means equal treatment and equal opportunity irrespective of sex. It doesn't mean absolute equality, as I believe. Male and females are two different variables, they are two different categories. They have their own characteristics, merits and demerits, and handicaps. And therefore, we should not aspire for absolute equality, rather, for equality of treatment and equality of opportunity. It recognizes that biological differences should never translate into social or economic disadvantage. Inequality is often justified through culture or religion, but in truth, it arises from centuries of patriarchal control over property, education, and decision making. The Indian Constitution guarantees equality before law, yet, genuine equality requires transformation of thought, mindset, and not only legal reform. Ancient India offers examples of egalitarian traditions where women debated philosophy and managed rituals. Later, male dominance reinterpreted religious authority to limit women's space. In fact, as I said earlier, there was decline of in the pristine religion, and now we were moving from Vedic religion to a Brahmanical religion, and therefore one can see deterioration in practices towards women. Globally, similar patterns existed from Aristotle's belief in female inferiority to Plato's call for equal education. Modern gender equality therefore seeks to restore what early societies partly recognized, that talent and virtue are not gender specific. In classrooms, homes, and workplace, equality means fairness in opportunities, pay, and respect. By studying how inequality was created and normalized, students can appreciate why equality remains a continuing struggle needing both awareness and active enforcement. Patriarchy refers to a social system in which men hold primary authority in family and community life. From childhood, individuals internalize gendered expectations. Boys learn to lead, girls to serve. Such conditioning appears harmless but silently shapes every institution. In Indian families, women often eat last or sacrifice education for siblings, reflecting how care and service are treated as feminine duties. These habits are not biologically fixed, they are products of long cultural reputation. Religion is frequently used to justify them, though ancient scriptures do not command such subordination. The real challenge is psychological, convincing society that equality benefits everyone. Patriarchy harms men too by forcing them into roles of dominance and emotional restraint. Understanding patriarchy helps explain why violence, wage gaps, and political exclusion persist even after legal reforms. Once these patterns are recognized, social change becomes possible through education, awareness, and shared domestic responsibility. Equality begins when families teach respect rather than obedience, and when gender is seen as partnership, not hierarchy. Cultural customs often preserve unequal relationships between men and women. Rituals such as Karwa Chauth or the wearing of Mangal Sutra, Bindi, or Sindoor may symbolize love and commitment, but also reinforce the notion that a woman's identity depends on her husband's life and status. These practices are cultural, not religious, yet they occupy deep emotional space. The problem arises when they become expectations instead of choices. In many societies, women are praised for self sacrifice while men are praised for success, creating double standards of virtue. The lecture stresses that respecting tradition should never mean accepting inequality. Culture is dynamic, it changes with social awareness. Indian civilization itself evolved from matrilineal communities to patriarchal ones and can evolve again towards equality by critically observing everyday customs. Students can distinguish between faith, which uplifts, and patriarchy, which limits. When culture begins to celebrate partnership rather than control, it strengthens both genders and enriches social harmony. And one thing to be noted here is that patriarchy is, of course, rule of the father or the domination of the males, but it is not only the males who sustain patriarchy, it is the society, including women, who play an important role in sustaining patriarchy. Philosophers across civilizations shaped attitudes towards gender. Aristotle described women as incomplete men and argued that nature intended them for obedience. Confucian thought in ancient China placed men as leaders and women as followers in a cosmic order. In contrast, Plato in his Republic proposed that men and women should share the same education and duties because virtue is the same in both. Plato's view represents the earliest rational argument for gender equality. These contrasting ideas influenced societies for centuries. One tradition legitimized subordination, and other encouraged reform. When students read these thinkers, they learn how intellectual frameworks become social norms, allows us to question inherited hierarchies and to value philosophical reasoning that upholds justice rather than prejudice. The history of ideas proves that equality has always had defenders. It only needed social courage to translate thought into policy. Ancient Indian texts present mixed images. Early Vedic literature portrays women as intellectual equals who could study the Vedas, perform sacrifices, and engage in philosophical debates. Names like Gargi, Maitreyi, and Lopamudra show that learning and spiritual authority were open to them. Later, with the codification of Brahmanical laws such as Manusmriti, the notions of protection by father, husband, and son appeared. Initially, it reflected concern for security in a changing society, but later, interpreters used it to justify control. However, I would like to mention the fact here that people use these scriptures and texts as per their convenience. While Manusmriti talks about the control of father, husband, and son, it also talks about Stridhan, an exclusive property of women in cash or kind that cannot be taken away from women in any situation. But we forgot those pro-women, provisions. Misreading of terms like dand, which originally meant guidance, turned moral direction into domination. Understanding this transformation is crucial. It reveals how language and interpretation can either preserve or destroy equality. By re examining early texts, scholars have found that Indian civilization once valued partnership between genders. Thus, reform movements in modern times are not Western imports but restoration of India's own ethical heritage. Even under patriarchy, women retained certain legal rights. The concept of Sridhan gave a woman exclusive ownership of gifts and property received at marriage from both families. This included jewelry, cash, and sometimes land. It could not be claimed by a husband or any other relative. Such recognition proves that ancient law acknowledged women's economic individuality. However, as social control tightened, these rights were eroded. Property became a male domain and women's economic dependence increased. The erosion of history then illustrates how social practices can quietly remove legal equality. And though this point I'll discuss in detail later on, but there is a study by Beena Agrawal. According to her, the economic security of women protects her against all sorts of domestic violence and abuse. If woman is the owner of a house or property or land, then the amount or the degree of domestic violence faced by her is minimum as compared to the women who is not in a position of such economic assets. Now, when reformers in the 19th century demanded women's property rights, they were reviving an older principle rather than inventing a new one. Economic autonomy remains essential for dignity. Without control over resources, equality cannot exist. Teaching about Stridhan reminds us that empowerment is deeply rooted in India's own legal traditions and not borrowed from outside cultures. Over centuries, the subordination of women became accepted as natural behavior. Families and communities taught girls to be silent and obedient, calling it modesty. Domestic violence, verbal abuse, and mental harassment were treated as private issues rather than social wrongs. Such normalization is dangerous because it hides injustice behind custom. When society excuses disrespect, it prepares ground for greater violence. And we see that in the last few years, we often saw an advertisement that if you hear screams or you get signs of violence within the four walls of the house, please immediately press the doorbell and intervene because it is no more a private sphere. It is a violation of human rights of an individual. It is a crime. So when society excuses disrespect, it prepares ground for greater violence. And therefore, we need to mentally prepare the society to not excuse disrespect. The lecture emphasizes that every insult, exclusion, or unequal rule is a violation of human dignity. Change begins with awareness that abuse is not tradition, it is oppression. The goal of studying these patterns is to expose how inequality survives through social approval. When we do not intervene, when we maintain silence, that look, when the husband is beating a wife, or when the father and the brother are uh, pushing or pressurizing a woman to get married to a certain individual and not a person of our own choice, then we are accepting that violence. Once individuals stop accepting unfair treatment as normal, the moral foundation of patriarchy begins to collapse. Or rather, I should say, the social foundation of patriarchy begins to collapse. Dignity is the moral core of human rights. It means the inherent worth of every person, regardless of gender, caste, or status. For women, dignity includes the right to safety, autonomy, and self respect. And of course, decision making. When violence or discrimination occurs, it destroys this sense of worth. Ancient Indian thought often linked womanhood with divinity, seeing the feminine as a sacred energy, but modern society frequently ignores that reverence. The challenge today is to convert symbolic respect into real equality. Legal safeguards can punish violations, but true Dignity requires social acceptance of women as independent entity. Teachers, parents, and leaders must demonstrate this through daily behavior. Only when then will equality move from text to practice. Dignity is not an abstract ideal. It is experienced when a woman can speak, work, and live without fear. The 19th century saw new voices demanding justice for women. In England, Mary Wollstonecraft argued that women should be educated to become rational companions, not decorative dependents. In India, Raja Ram Mohan Roy campaigned against sati and for widow remarriage, calling such reforms essential for national progress. Savitri Bai Phule opened schools for girls, providing that education could break caste and gender barriers. These reformers connected morality with equality. A society cannot be virtuous while half of its members are denied growth. Their movements combined religion and reason, showing that true faith supports compassion and learning. Students should note that early feminism in India was deeply spiritual as well as social. Respecting women was considered dharmic. It was part of dharma, religion, spirituality. It sought not confrontation but moral awakening, preparing ground for later constitutional reforms. After the devastation of World War II, the global community recognized equality as a foundation for peace. The United Nations Charter of 1945 reaffirmed equal rights of men and women. And in 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights stated that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. India's delegate Hansa Mehta played a decisive role by changing the draft phrase all men to all human beings. This ensured that women's equality was written into international law. Her contribution symbolizes India's leadership in global gender justice. The United Nations framework transformed women's issues from private matters to universal concerns. For students, this movement marks the entry of women's rights into international diplomacy, proving that equality is not only a national question but a worldwide responsibility shared by all governments. In 1946, the United Nations established the Commission on the Status of Women to monitor progress and recommend policies for gender equality. It became the central platform for global cooperation on women's education, employment, and political participation. Through its reports and conventions, the Commission helped shape rational reforms, especially in newly independent countries like India. It also laid groundwork for later milestones such as CEDAW in 1979 and the World Women Conferences from 1975 onwards. The Commission's work shows how international institutions can guide domestic change. Though we will later discuss women conferences, though World Women Conferences, uh, but I would not say that they made changes overnight or made dramatic revolutionary changes in the status of women, but they played an important role in sensitizing the world community. They acted as sign marks to the world community, to the states, with vis-a-vis women rights. For India, participation in these initiatives meant aligning its constitutional values with global norms. Students should see this as the beginning of a partnership between local reform and international advocacy that continues to influence uh, laws and public awareness even today. Statistics reveal the economic face of gender discrimination. About 70% of the world's poor are women. Two-thirds of illiterate adults are female, and on average, women earn only three quarters of men's wages for the same work. These numbers, drawn from global studies, confirm that inequality is systemic rather than accidental. Economic dependence restricts women's freedom in every sphere. In developing nations, unpaid domestic labor remains invisible yet essential. When policy ignores this contribution, poverty deepens. Empowering women through education, credit, and property ownership raises entire communities out of deprivation. Thus, gender equality is not only a moral issue but an economic strategy. Teaching these facts help students link statistics to social structures and understand why sustainable development requires gender justice. If we talk about everyday inequality in India, in Indian households, inequality often appears in subtle habits. This is a common practice in Indian families, especially in the middle class, upper and lower, that women eat after all family members have finished, believing it is their duty to serve first. And therefore, many times the food is over or remains in very less quantities. And therefore, women, instead of cooking fresh for themselves, uh, remain content with whatever they remaining food they receive. So it is not money or it is not the lack of resources. It is this practice that leads to chronic anemia and malnutrition. Even among educated families, such behavior stems from the cultural idea of self-reliance, self-sacrifice, and not poverty alone. It illustrates how discrimination can hide inside affection and duty. Changing this requires both awareness and example. Families must learn that caring includes self care. Nutrition, rest, and health are rights, not indulgences. When women are healthy, the family and nation are stronger. Discussing these issues in classrooms help students question everyday customs that seem normal but actually maintain inequality. True reforms begins not only in law but in dining room and conversations at home. How to restore or reclaim equality? Restoring equality means rediscovering values that once honored women's intellect and moral strength. Education is the most powerful tool for this transformation. Reformers from ancient to modern times emphasized learning as the path of independence. Awareness campaigns, self help groups, and political participation continue that legacy today. The Indian tradition that once produced scholars like Gargi and rulers like Lakshmi Bai and Razia Sultan reminds us that competence knows no gender. By linking modern empowerment with historical respect, society gains confidence in its own culture. Equality is not imitation of the West, it is renewal of India's original spirit of balance between man and woman. When education, law, and culture work together, the cycle of discrimination can finally be controlled, if not ended completely. To conclude, let us once again see the history of women's rights, which is a continuous movement from recognition to restriction to renewal. Understanding this journey helps students grasp how social values evolve and how deeply gender justice is tied to national progress. Modern constitutional safeguards are not sudden gifts, they are outcomes of centuries of resistance and reform. Studying women's rights encourages critical thinking about everyday life, media portrayals, and policy decisions. It also reminds us that equality begins with respect in person relationship. As we continue to the next lectures from prehistoric societies to modern governance, Remember that the aim is not to idealize the past, but to learn how justice was achieved, lost, and regained, and what lessons do we have to learn from the past. Was it law or was it the mindset? Was it the pristine Vedic religion or it is the Brahmanical religion that secured women's position in the society and maintained women dignity? The ultimate lesson is simple. A society that honors women's dignity secures its own humanity. Thank you.